You and I seem to share this fairly optimistic view on the world that everyone can learn at any stage.
Yeah.
And I wanted to use that, I guess, as a little bit of a transition. I don't know how this is going to work here, but I was going to transition between these two books. So essentially, you've got your Humanity Works perspective, which is very, very useful for young people and people any age that need to understand, I guess, what emerging technologies and they should learn and at what level and how to do it, and keeping this human perspective. And then I'm just thinking that a lot of the perspectives that I write about here in Future Tech, they're frameworks that anybody can pick up. And I guess I had a little bit the MBA segment in mind when I was thinking what this book is about, but also really people anywhere in the workplace who are sort of saying to themselves, yeah, there's all of this technology and I need to learn that. And this, I think, is where we synergize quite a bit, because, I mean, I kind of say that technology is never driven by technology, right? It's kind of an absurd thing
to say. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
But there's many, many other aspects. So you want to be a technology expert? Well, you have to be an expert on government regulation. You have, in regulated markets, there's even no choice. But even in other industries, you have to understand what's going to happen when this technology hits the wall. And you have to understand what we were just talking about for the longest time, social dynamics. If you don't understand how the technology is going to impact a consumer group, well, then you don't have a technology at all, or it won't succeed.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand the business model, right, which used to be a topic, it's a big topic in my book, it's a whole chapter, but it used to be something only professors at business schools cared about,
right?
Like business models, right? Very dry topic. Well, it turns out you can invent a business model and you invent a new market.
Yeah.
And there is a technology underpinning it. Suddenly you're Uber, or you are, this is just quite interesting how technology isn't technology.
Yeah, no.
Not in the sense of like dry coding or machines. Like, it is so much more than that.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And the implications of technology, I think people don't take the time to go that additional step. And you talk a lot about ethics and the role of government, which, as we talked about before we started taping, is extraordinarily important in every case study that I read where there is a successful implementation of a new technology. Inevitably, the government, which, by the way, is usually not the United States, is influential in some shape or form, because you do need to have policy that's tied to that in order for it to work effectively. And that's one of the things that I love about this, is that, you've got a whole chapter on that. And I feel like that's an area that we so often skim over. Like, what role does government need to play? And I know there's been a lot of talk around having a U.S. Office of the Future, which to me should have been done 50 years ago. Like, why do we not have that? Because that way you could have government early on involved in some of the technology development that's going to have these huge applications in terms of consumer adoption. And I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I would have to say, people ask me what keeps me up at night. And probably one of the biggest things that keeps me up at night is around that implication subject. It's what happens when we become a completely tech-dependent society. So all these trends you talk about in future tech come to fruition, and the technology breaks. So you have a system that goes down and we can't do anything about it. What happens when you have so many technologies that are not integrated that user adoption falters and you can't get people to work with it? Like, what happens when you have bandwidth access issues, when you have inequities in the way people access technologies? And so these are a bunch of implications. We can have the technology out there, and that's good, and we need it, but we also need to plan for disruptions with that technology. And this is, again, tying back to the government topic, I think an area where government can be really helpful if it's integrated in the right way, which I tend to see. I'm so glad you talked about it so much, because I have to admit, in Humanity Works, I don't really think, I might have touched on it very briefly, but not enough.
Well, I speak about government, and there's so many roles that government has. And, obviously, everyone has a different relationship to government because of where they grew up and what they have experienced. And some people have a very negative relationship and sort of are very down on government. And they say, well, government should stay out of this. They're never very competent. But, whatever your view is on government and wherever you live, the truth of the matter that the governance function goes actually even beyond government. And right. I don't actually spend enough time in this book on that topic. It's more an evolving discussion, but governance is actually a function of society. So, the reason why it is a disruptive force among sort of 4 or 5 that I spend a lot of time on is that it actually is relevant even in private sector. So there's a reason why is not only do you need to care about how your technology is going to be regulated, but a lot of what happens in industry even, it could also be conceived of as a governance function. Like, you set up standards, you think about interoperability of technologies with other technologies of your competitors, or even just with legacy stuff that it has to work with. So this is very basic. The function of basically what it is government as a function is really good at coordinating.
Yeah.
Right? So you're reducing friction and coordinating, supporting things that actually need support very early on. Think about all the R&D that government has done, created the internet, space travel, which then, has created an enormous amount of products that we use in our everyday life. It's not something that would have happened without the long-term view and without the embryo that the government can create. And on the excessive side, right, when things just become too big and too unwieldy and start going awry and start affecting social groups in a disproportionate way, who is going to say that enough is enough? You have to have a governance function, whether that is, the US or the EU or China or whoever it is that comes in and says, this is not okay. It's hurting our citizens. In the future, I think the governance function is going to be mutually carried out by these enormous conglomerates that are growing up, whether it is the FANG companies or a combination of the FANG companies with the biggest governments, whatever end up being the biggest governments, in the future. They have to decide together.
Yeah, and I hope they do it responsibly. And this is one of my concerns with big tech, is that the bottom line will always supersede ethical and moral considerations, and that we still have all this bias being built into our AI applications. And it's not on purpose. It's not that people are setting out to develop bias applications. It's just that you have this narrow pool of people who are developing that are usually Caucasian males between the ages of 25 and 35. And that's a very limited segment of society. So I worry about that, and I worry that the infrastructure for governance is not in place really in the traditional government or in big conglomerates, and that the technology is evolving too quickly to put the proper regulation behind it.
I think that's right. In many countries, that's certainly the case. And, that could be an implicit criticism of government and how we recruit people to public service. Like, I actually think that the public servant of the future needs to be a little bit what it was in the past, a very respected person that knew an enormous amount and was delegated authority by the community because the others sort of realized, well, this person has studied all these things and thinks really deeply about all these issues that could arise. That's the person I want to run, the big things, the big decisions. Yeah. And it isn't like that always anymore. Government is something it's like a necessity you put aside. I think actually one of the most important things we could do as a society would be to transform the public sector workforce around the world. That would be the single most, I think, productive thing we could do at this juncture. And then also, I think, transforming how big tech and large conglomerates really work, right? Mm-hmm. And that is about capturing value from the long term, from the long term trends that you're seeing. So it's interesting. It's how workforce and humanity and technology actually is 3 sort of sides of the same issue. Mm-hmm. You can't develop excellent technology without thinking even about the workforce that's going to create this in a productive way. And you really, yeah, I mean, future technology, what is it? It's so often assumed that it's something you just go away and magically discover.
Right.
Right.
It doesn't exist in a vacuum. I don't know. One of the things, as you were talking, I kept thinking about China and the fact that China is out there testing algorithms on, you know, millions and millions of people without their knowledge, because they've got that society where the government just does what it wants. And that's why they've become quickly ahead of the market, more sophisticated. And I wonder about some of these discrepancies in social and moral attitudes that will lead to one country or another potentially getting ahead in this race for technology. Just kind of similar to how the Cold War was and the space race.
Well, but there's more actors though than just countries acting. But let's think about sort of next decade issues around this sort of workforce and technology topic. Do you really think that we're moving into an age where one country is going to dominate over another, or is it going to be more complicated than countries? Because even if you look at large companies, they may have national origin, right? But their workforce, to get back to that, is largely going to be international.
Yeah, global.
So at least the best companies, in my mind, right, they have started to try to recruit a diverse workforce, because they realize what you just stated earlier, which is if the males between 25 and 40 are developing all the products, those are not the products the world's going to need in the next 2-3 decades.
Right.